is our second talk in the Indian Knowledge Systems course for this semester, which is dedicated to literatures of India, the whole landscape of Indian literatures, which is, as we all know, very vast and rich. So we're going to visit not only different literatures, but also different regions, different languages, different modes of expressing literature through a variety of scholars. So today we have with us Professor Srinivas Reddy, who is probably well known to most of you. He has been with us for many, many years. I hardly need to introduce him. I will only say that he's a very well-known scholar of classical Sanskrit, Telugu, and Tamil, a rare combination to some extent, also of classical Indian music, and has been teaching courses here as well as at Brown University related to those fields. So today and tomorrow, he's going to give us a sort of a landscape of classical Telugu literature. And I believe tomorrow in particular we'll have a session on Krishna Deva Raya's great epic poem, the Amukta Malyada poem about Andal, the Bhakti saint of the Tamil land. So this is enough introduction, I believe. Now over to you, Srini, and we are keen to listen to you.
So first, I just want to say again, thank you to Michelle and everyone, the whole team, Shivani, Mana, Ankita, Devarsh, all of you who put this together. I know it's a lot to organize, many moving parts, many speakers. It's not an easy thing, so I thank all of you for doing that. I thank you for supporting this kind of research and bringing people together to discuss some, I think, very important ideas, which arguably are historical in nature, but I also believe incredibly relevant to many of the issues that we still contend with today in India, relating to language, identity, academic inquiry, knowledge in general, history, all of these kinds of big ideas are still very much part of our consciousness. And I think one of the critical reasons why these kinds of programs in the Indian knowledge system, what that means generally, is that, a lot of our discourse has not relied upon the theoretical conceptions and frameworks that have already been populated in Indian history to deal with these issues, which we have been dealing with for so many years. So I'm going to present some ideas from, my own research in a very broad sense. I'd be happy to have discussion. I prefer discussion more than anything else. So just to start off right here, the image that you're seeing is, kind of looks like it could be an image of Lakshmi or some, nice devata, but this is an image of a goddess known as Telugu Talli, the Telugu mother. And, fairly new idea of, Telugu as a language being embodied as a feminine deity and what that represents. And of course, particularly in regard to Telugu, it's interesting to talk about language and identity issues, even from a political sense, because, Telugu was the first place, oddly enough, because Telugu studies are quite low if you consider regional language studies. But Telugu or Andhra, generally, again, we'll talk about what that means, was the locus where, the whole regionally defined state kind of mandates began in India, like in 56. So it's very interesting that, language, identity, region, they have an interesting history when we talk about Telugu language and literature. And like I said, it's quite ironic, I guess, the fact that there isn't much, kind of support, even amongst Telugu speaking people, to study Telugu or to support Telugu studies in general. And that's in a very interesting kind of inverse relationship to the amount of pride that people espouse towards Telugu literature, which is interesting. Although, you know, we can get into some of these more fascinating ideas later on. So today's lecture is going to be more about Telugu just generally as it came into its own as a literary medium. And of course, these are all words that we need to kind of explore. What does literature mean? What do I mean when I say literary? What does the word classical in that sense mean? All of these things we can interrogate, and there's no, you know, definitive right or wrong answer. And I'll try to complicate some of these ideas as we go along. So let's first start here. What region we're talking about? There's many, just from an etymological perspective, there's many, you know, folk etymologies, classical etymologies given to this word Telugu and where it came from. One of them is Trilinga. And of course, this is a very kind of Sanskritic, I think, interpretation. But the idea was that there were these three great, you know, Shivalayas, three great lingas that kind of mapped out a certain kind of territory. And you can kind of see it in this map, this triangular area. And, you know, at some level, this maps out to the three main, you know, regions within the Telugu speaking kind of, you know, zone. And they are of course, Andhra. So that's like coastal Andhra. So like, you know, all this Godavari and Krishna Delta, that region towards the coast. You have Telangana, more interior region, you know, like where Hyderabad is, let us say. And then Rayalaseema, which is further down to the south. And it's these three regions that really, you know, generally are identified as Telugu speaking. And as you all well know, the original state of Andhra Pradesh was, you know, somewhat recently, like 10 years ago or something, bifurcated into Andhra and Telangana. And again, you know, things get political, but not to say that this conception of a difference between these regions was not there from the beginning. This was there even, you know, in 56. So, and there is, you know, arguably a very, you know, clear and palpable difference that one could discern between Andhra Telugu or Telangana Telugu or Rayalaseema Telugu. You know, if you hear it, you'll know. But I would just make a point that, you know, I was kind of reading up on some recent scholarship on Telugu, and, you know, people make this claim that, you know, that these languages are not mutually intelligible. And, you know, that is simply not true. I mean, I can, you know, my family, you know, actually my family is different too. My mom's side is more from Nellore side, and my dad's side is more from, you know, Andhra side. Now, arguably, you know, my mom will tease my dad and my dad will tease my mom about, oh, you say this like this, or you say like, but they understand each other. So you can perceive difference of diction and, you know, maybe word usage and accent and, you know, things like that. But fundamentally, you can understand both languages or all three of the different kinds of dialects, if you will. So I want to stress that they are mutually intelligible. That is, you can understand them easily enough, even though you can perceive difference. And I think that's also important to just mention. And I think a lot of modern scholarship is moving away from this idea of mutual intelligibility. But anyway, that's a separate discussion, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like. Okay, another derivation of the word Telugu is supposed to come from Tene. Tene means honey. So Tene Telugu, they say like Telugu is like honey. It's a very sweet language. Another derivation is the Telagas. These are a group or a tribe of people. So the group that spoke this language were the Telagas, and therefore their language is Telugu. Again, it's not totally clear. All of, you know, no one can say for sure, is what I'm saying, what the clearest, you know, most perfect derivation is, and there probably isn't any kind of clear definition. Let me just pop out of this for a second and move this over a bit, and I will try to get it going again. So here's Srinatha, one of the great, Telugu poets around 1400. And Srinatha was interesting because unlike other poets that would look at what we would call Asthana Kavis, Asthana Kavi means, they sat like in a court and they just like, they were there and, they served a king and they did what they did. Srinatha definitely served kings, but he was an itinerant type of poet. He would go to one king, write a poem for them, and then move on. And in this way, his itinerancy of his life kind of, in many ways, and people have argued for this, marked out that Telugu-speaking land. And so Srinatha is a very interesting character in being able to define what Telugu is, because he kind of traveled through all of these lands. So this is a verse from him. Seeing its diction, some say it's tough as Sanskrit. Hearing the idiom, others say it's Telugu. Let them say what they want. I couldn't care less. My poetry is the true language of this land. So there's a sense that, like, exactly what I'm trying to say, like, it doesn't really matter how you're going to define it, how you're going to call it. There could be many interpretations. The bottom line is, when you hear it, you know. And that's the real point, that there's a certain kind of knowingness that comes with, being there. So that's Srinatha. All right, okay, here we go. Now, this is kind of the heart of the lecture, at least from a theoretical standpoint, that I want to bring forth. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in this little chart. But let me start by saying this. And this is I've been thinking about this a lot. This is like a very interesting idea, because it really applies to our modern study of India too. Now, we'll get to kind of the beginnings of Telugu literature and what that really means. But the bottom line is, and I was telling Michelle and others this before, like, you can't talk about Telugu without talking about Sanskrit, at least from a literary perspective. It's just impossible, because so much of what constitutes Telugu literature is defined by models derived from, Sanskrit. For example, take Vyakarana, grammar. Grammar is how we define a language. It's like the rules, the usages, all these things. Telugu Vyakarana itself is derived from Sanskrit Vyakarana. Now, this is a very interesting idea in the sense that the tools by which we define ourselves are actually not our own tools. It's not even our own language. There are tools derived from a culture of, perceived prestige. For example, right now, if you really look at the world of what we may call South Asian studies, that is the study of India, the study of South Asia, the bulk of writing and the bulk of scholarship that's being done, and the bulk of scholarship that is esteemed and privileged, is not in an Indian language, is in no Indian language at all. It's in English. We define ourselves with tools outside of our own language. This is a really important thing to think about. And I'm just kind of stressing how this is even true historically. Okay, so hold on to that kind of big idea. Now, let me give you 4 words that come out of this Telugu Vyakarana in the early point. So, and you guys might have heard of all of these things. They're quite interesting to just think about. So, tat sama, equal to that. Tat sama means, and these are words that are used to define words. Okay, so a tat sama is like when you take a Sanskrit word and then boom, you use it exactly in the same form, in the same shape, and in Telugu. So that's tat sama. So let's say vrikshamu. Okay, vrikshamu. Vriksha is the Sanskrit word. Vrikshamu becomes the Telugu. It's equivalent. Fine. Okay. Then you have tadbhava. Tadbhava is kind of like the same thing, but it's gone through kind of an intermediary morphological change. So, for example, this is very common, like you can see in okay, even I'm trying to think of a word like Agni. Agni becomes Agi. No, Agi. It's not exactly Agni, but it's derived from Agni. So these are things that are like derivative words. This is very common in all the Prakrits that you find. And these are kind of basic morphological changes that happen. For example, what I just explained, like, conjunct consonant, reducing down to a doubling. For example, you'll find this in, like, let's say like dharma. In Pali, dharma becomes dhamma, right? That R, becomes an M. So these kinds of little changes happen. Those are morphological changes, but basically they're Sanskrit words. Okay, then you have Desha. Desha, of course, from Des, Desi, means regional words. Desha are words that are particular to those regions. And these are funny because, Sanskrit, etymologists, the whole Nirukta tradition, we love, and this, of course, flows into Telugu also, we love, finding etymologies. So sometimes, they'll find like a funny way to give a Sanskritic etymology to a Desya word. Other times they won't. They'll just say it's a Desya type word. We can't find any equivalent in Sanskrit. It's just a regional word that we've incorporated into the language. Lastly is Gramya, from Gramyam, like a village. So Gramya has that sense of, let's say it's even more removed from that kind of Sanskritic influence, but more so, and this is interesting, Gramya has that meaning that these are words that are not permissible in a literary sense. They're not good words to use in literature. So just to summarize quickly, Tatsama, Tadbhava both are clearly Sanskrit derived. Desha are basically regional words that sometimes get a Sanskrit, origin put on top of them. And then Gramya are, let us say, purely regionalized words, which are considered kind of not acceptable for literary usage. Okay. Now hold on to this idea. Now let's move again, like, to the heart of this. I talk about this every lecture I give. No matter what topic I talk about, I always end up talking about this thing. What is this? This whole Marga versus Desi. And this concept, these are great concepts that Indians came up with and applied in various, different contexts. And, I'm going to explain how in this literary context of Telugu and Sanskrit, it's even more interesting because at one level, Marga and Desi means, well, Sanskrit was the Marga. It was the way, it was the high kind of thing. And Telugu literature was Desi literature. It was regional literature. Okay, at the beginning of, the advent of Telugu literature, this was indeed the case. You could say that. Marga ante Sanskritam, Desi means Telugu. What happens later? And again, this is fascinating kind of stuff. What happens by the time you get to, let us say, Krishnadevaraya's time, is that Marga and Desi are terms that are used not in regard to Sanskrit and Telugu, but in regard to different kinds of Telugu literature itself. So there's kind of like a high Marga type of Telugu, and there's a Desi type of Telugu. So that Marga Telugu is a courtly kind of Telugu, which follows all these Sanskrit models. And then the Desi Telugu is this more, often they call it temple Telugu, although that's not, I don't think that's the best word for it, but it's Desi Telugu that uses different kinds of meters and more Telugu words, less Sanskrit forms, that kind of thing. What I'm trying to stress here is the distinction between Marga Desi, once applied from Sanskrit to Telugu, but then slowly as time evolved, also applied internally to Telugu literature itself. And really what we're getting at is this kind of a, you know, I don't want to put it in a high-low kind of way, but that is kind of what it's about. There is a kind of prestige, a kind of, you know, an idea of class kind of involved in it. And this is, you know, again, tricky to discuss, but I'll give you some examples from the literature which might make this more clear. So before we get any further, let's first talk about, you know, when we talk about the advent of Telugu literature, or all of the, you know, whether it's Kannada and Telugu actually have very kind of parallel histories in terms of their evolution as literary languages. And a lot of these stories, particularly the one I'm going to tell you right now about Nannaya, you know, we have to, you know, Nannaya, of course, great poet, but we have to understand that these are also kind of stories of Genesis that evolved over time. Right? So we receive a tradition that understands that Telugu literature began, you know, in 1050 with Nannaya. Well, it's really hard to believe that there was a vacuum and then all of a sudden Nannaya popped into existence and Telugu literature happened. So now we're doing more research into these kind of things. We're learning about other poets that were there actually maybe prior to Nannaya. We're doing more research into epigraphical research, like Michelle just sent me an article, you know, 575, almost 500 years before this, there's Telugu inscriptions. Now, of course, epigraphic stuff is often not like high kavya type of literature. A lot of times it's land grant stuff and that kind of thing, but you do have what they call prashastis. That's kind of praise poems to kings. So there is a level of literariness even coming in to some of that epigraphical evidence that we have. So all I'm trying to say is that, you know, it's wonderful to have these stories of like the Adi Kavi, you know, Nannaya is the Adi Kavi, the first poet of Telugu. That's fine, that's good. But we have to also understand that these are also stories which are built up over time to tell a certain kind of narrative about how a language evolves. So that, for example, this image, I don't know who did it, but it was made into a stamp. And this is Nannaya, the Adi Kavi of Telugu literature, presenting to Rajaraja Narendra, which is basically in Rajamandri, in 1050, his Telugu version of the Bharatam. So the Āndhra-Mahābhāratamu. Now, this in and of itself is a perfect example that all of, like, for example, Kannada is the same way, you know, Pampa Bharatam, you know, to start your literature. What do you need to start a literature? What will give it prestige and importance and a good place and show that this is a literary, wow, everybody needs a Bharatam. So if you can make the Mahabharata happen in Telugu, then that's like a great beginning. So like that, there's a reason why the Bharatam is told first. There's a reason why it gets that position. There's a reason why people wanted that and what it had to it. You know, the Ramayana gets translated many times, actually. The Bharatam, not so much. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a prestige level attached to a text like the Bharatam and what that means for anyone who wants to kind of start a literalizing process in a region, be it in Telugu or in Kannada. Okay, now quickly moving through, let's look at a few other poets, and just to give you a sense of the kind of variety of Telugu literature. So first we can look at Somanatha. There's only a couple hundred years after Nannaya. And Somanatha, for example, comes from a very different tradition. He is not a court poet. He is not a Brahmin. He writes, for example, in Dwipada. Dwipada is a metrical form that's, you know, considered not as advanced as, you know, the forms that, you know, Nannaya and others used. He wrote Basava Puranam. So he wrote about the whole Virashaiva movement. You know, this was, again, a type of counter movement to, you would say, you know, the more how do I put it, you know, well-established courtly type of devotion that was happening at the time. Let me put it in that general sense. So Somanatha is representative of something that's very different than like a Nannaya. Okay, then we'll look at, let's say, two other people, Pōddana and Srinatha. Now, Pōddana and Srinatha, again, there are stories told about Srinatha and Pōddana. They're supposed to be brother-in-laws, actually. Probably not true, but that's okay. But the stories told about them are, again, told to represent a certain type of differentiation within the literary tradition. Srinatha is supposed to be, he wrote Naishadam. Naishadam is the great Mahakavya of Sri Harsha, written in Sanskrit. Srinatha wrote it in Telugu. And like I said, he went to all these courts, and he lived a very lavish life, he was that kind of really, freewheeling, luxury loving type of poet, Srinatha. Whereas Pōddana writes the Bhagavatam, okay, more devotional in nature. And Pōddana is supposed to have, he might have been a court poet at one point, but apparently he got very frustrated with all these kings, like the verse in the bottom shows you. Got frustrated with all these kings, and then basically he's supposed to have led a very humble life in the village, just writing these poems for Krishna. So Pōddana represents the kind of merging of the bhakti influence, the idea that like poetry is devotional by nature. It's not about getting riches and getting fancy stuff and being at a court. It's more about your devotion to God and the love of religious life and that kind of thing. So Pōddana and Srinatha get paired up to show this kind of differentiation. So let me read this poem by, all these translations I did in different papers and stuff, but this is what Pōddana says. Rather than giving my work to those vile lords of men and accepting towns, chariots, and measly money, I'll leave this tired body without death's hammer blows. For only I, Bammera Pottaraju, happily give my Bhagavatam to Srihari for the benefit of the world. So, whereas Srinatha is basically the servant of kings, Pōddana is saying, I'm a servant of God. And, I'm just showing all of these things to give some kind of layout of the differentiation of, different strands within this world of Telugu literature. Okay. Now let's go back to this idea of the relationship between Sanskritam and Telugu. So Janani Sanskritam, that the Sanskrit is the mother of all languages. And this is actually a very interesting idea that we're going to come back to in a second. I'll show you some examples from the colonial period. So Sanskrit is the mother of all languages, but Telugu is the best regional language. So you find that interesting phrase here, Desha Bhasha Landu Telugu Lessa, that will be recycled by Raya, Krishnadeva Raya, in his Amuktama. This is from Kridabhiramam. So it's a couple centuries, maybe at least a century earlier. So it's interesting. But anyway, I'm just getting at the point. Sanskrit is the mother of languages, but Telugu is the best regional language. Though the mother of the world is praised for her auspiciousness, isn't the daughter better? So of course, this is kind of like a teasing kind of poem. But the idea is that, the mother of languages is great. That kind of seniority of position and prestige is great. But the younger language is kind of, is more attractive, is sexier. It's something else that we want. So there's that idea. What's important here, though, that I wanted to stress is that no one is yet debating this idea that Sanskrit is the mother of all languages. Okay, and we'll come back to this in a second. So here's another example. I think this was, these are what they call chatu verses. Chatu verses are padyalu that come from, just the oral tradition. They're not like in a text per se. So apparently one day there was a Sanskrit poet who came to probably Krishnadevaraya's court, and he was making fun of Telugu literature. So he said, Āndhra-Mahābhāratamu kavyam ayomaya vibhushanam. So this poetry that you compose in Telugu is like an iron necklace. So this Sanskrit pundit came and he said that first line. And then right away, Tenali Ramakrishna got up and gave him this wonderful, second line to complete it. So if Telugu is this iron necklace, it's really just a chain for scholars, a shrinkala, chain for scholars wandering through a Sanskrit jungle, Samskrita aranya, right? Like wild elephants, matteba. So in this way, we get stories of how the relationship between Sanskrit and Telugu are being compared, are being, appreciated, but there's also a sense that Telugu is kind of coming into its own and people are understanding it as distinctive and maybe even more expressive than a language like Sanskrit, which for the most part, by this stage at least, is very true. Okay, so the theme that we're really talking about when we talk about like the advent of these literatures is something called vernacularization. That's the term that has been given. This applies to languages all around the world. If you read Sheldon Pollock's very famous book, The Language of Gods and the World of Men, half of the book actually covers Europe. So, the idea of like Italian and French and, English even, all, rising up as literary languages out of what was earlier considered the only languages to write stuff in, which were, of course, Latin and maybe Greek. So the definition of vernacularization given here is the historical process of choosing to create a written language along with its complement, a political discourse, and this is interesting, in local languages according to models supplied by the superordinate, usually cosmopolitan, literary culture. And I think that last part is really important. And it's kind of what I was getting at earlier about how, even Telugu Vyakarana is based in Sanskrit. In fact, the first apparent, there's some debate on this, but the first Telugu grammar wasn't even written in Telugu. The first grammar of Telugu was written in Sanskrit. That's how, embedded all of this stuff is. So the other important word that Pollock comes up with is the idea of, the Sanskrit cosmopolis, what that really means, a kind of, a type of hegemonic functionality that culturally persisted for many, hundreds of years in many parts of South Asia and beyond, that was deeply, related to the Sanskrit language itself. So, and this is Ramanujan in 93. This is well before Pollock came up with this thing. But Ramanujan says, A.K. Ramanujan, I'm saying, says Sanskrit by its existence expressed and confirmed a social organization of tradition that depended, this is important, on a dichotomy between great pan-Indian elite traditions, i.e. what I've been calling Marga, and many local little vernacular traditions, what we've been calling Desi, with bilingual mediators between them. So this idea, like I said, I talk about it in every lecture, this intersecting helix of Marga and Desi, local and regional, pan-regional, all of that is really at the heart of everything that's happening in this discussion. Okay, now to bring it up to, yeah, we have a little bit of time, just to bring this up to a little bit more, not contemporary, but at least to the colonial period. We have this idea of what Troutman calls the Dravidian proof, which is interesting because, and this was happening at College of Fort St. George in Madras in Chennai. And what's really interesting to me, particularly, is, I mean, Ellis made this proposal after his study of Telugu and other languages, but he was also in discussion with two Telugu pundits, Shankaraya, who was in Madras, and Purushottam, who was in Machilipatnam. Now, what's interesting is that Shankaraya, who was in Madras, obviously probably was around a lot of Tamil-speaking people. He kind of, understood Telugu as some kind of a mixture between Tamil and Sanskrit. Does not see Tamil and Sanskrit. Purushottam just sees Telugu as a derivative of Sanskrit coming down slowly, in like a linear fashion. What I'm trying to say is that Purushottam still sees that, this Janani Samskritambu is there, that Sanskrit is the mother and that Telugu is just like this far down daughter. Now, what Shankaraya is really getting at, and what Ellis is fundamentally, positing, is that the real kind of deep origins of Telugu are not in Sanskrit, but in Tamil. But after centuries of Sanskrit influence coming in and mixing, then you have this very interesting mix of Tamil and Sanskrit happening together. Now, I'm just mentioning this just to show that even in this colonial period, there was difference amongst even Telugu scholars about the nature and origin of the Telugu language. And this is really interesting. Now, from a modern, linguistic perspective, we classify Telugu, along with Tamil and Kannada and Malayalam and Tulu, as Dravidian languages because they share a common base. The kind of roots of the language are Dravidian. And, for my study, I also feel that same way. Things get a little bit more complicated as we go along. Okay, now I know I said a lot of things here. I'm going to give you one little interesting example of this whole Marga Desi kind of interaction, and probably in an area that doesn't get talked about enough. And I certainly don't have much time to go into it now, but just to give you a sense and a feeling of it, and then to leave you with a verse that will take us into tomorrow's talk. I want to talk about Chandas. Chandas, this is prosody. This is how, different systems of metrical analysis work. So what's interesting is the Telugu Chandas uses many aspects. In fact, it uses the basic tools and language of Sanskrit prosody, but then adds kind of its own special varieties of that. And this is a perfect example of how, again, you have like a system that inherits a certain kind of, framework and then refashions it to fit what's necessary. So if some of you have studied Chandas at all, many times we work in a Gana system. So this Gana system basically looks at, there's only basically two things you can be in terms of a syllable. You can be Lagu or you can be Guru. You can be short or you can be long. And so if we did that, you guys are all math guys. How many combinations of short and long can you have if you have three kind of groupings? Well, there's 8. And that's what that Trika system is showing you. And for the most part, I mean, there's different kinds of meters in Sanskrit too, but let us say what we call the Vritta meters in Sanskrit all follow some formulation of the Gana system. Okay? Now, what's interesting is, so those are, and they're listed out as Ya, Ma, Ta, Ra, Ja, Ba, Na, and Sa. And that, on the left there, you can see there's a very nice mnemonic that you can learn. Yamata Raja Bhanasa. My teachers used to always tell me that. So if you memorize that one line, you can figure out what all the three means, because Ya means Yamata. So Ya means short, long, long. Like that. You can Matara means Ma is long, long, long. Like that. So you don't have to worry about these chaturmatra ones. Those are the ones I'm saying. Those are matra meters. They're different. And even arguably, by the way, Sanskrit probably picked those up from decimeters a long time ago. And people don't talk about this enough too, that, you know, we always are constantly thinking that everything was derived from Sanskrit. You know, well, we took that form. Well, there was a lot of information going upward too from very long time ago. Like, for example, the Arya meter, if you looked at the Arya meter in Sanskrit, it's almost definitely some kind of a regional decimeter. Okay, anyway, getting back to this real quick, these 8 ganas that in the top that you see on the right, they were not sufficient for Telugu. So Telugu has these other set of meters called, or ganas, called Indras and Suryas. And it's these Indras and Suryas that come together to formulate Telugu meters. So let me just show you. For example, up at the top, you have the Shardula, Mattevam, Utpalamala, Champakamala. These are all Sanskrit meters that were imported directly into Sanskrit. And by the way, these are some of the biggest meters that we have, longest syllables, 19, 20, 21 syllables. They're really big meters. But then you have these other meters, what we call Telugu meters, Desi meters. And these Desi meters only use those Telugu ganas, the Surya ganas and the Indra ganas. So I'm just going to end by parsing this out. We can talk about this. This is the very famous verse, which we'll talk about. Telugu delayanna desambu telagenu Telugu vallabundu Telugu konda. Now that goes on. Now, if I parse that, if I scan that, the scansion for it is lagu lagu lagu, guru lagu, guru lagu, guru guru lagu, lagu lagu guru lagu. Like that, we can go through all of them, and let me show you how it looks when you put it together into these different ganas. So this is how it looks when you put it together into the different ganas, and we can clearly see that this is not a Sanskrit meter. This is a Telugu meter. This is known as Atavelladi. It has a certain formulation. I just wanted to show this is an example of how a Sanskritic framework is reformulated to fit the needs of a regional language, and then gets, you know, deployed by, you know, scholars and, you know, poets to create these different versions. Now, what this verse means, as you all well know, is, again, it's a repeat of that Desha Bhasalandu Telugu Lessa, but now this is in Amuktamalida, when the great Āndhra-Mahāvishnu comes to Rayalu and says, if you ask why Telugu, because God tells Raya to compose something in Telugu. And the God says, if you ask why Telugu, if you ask why Telugu, it is because this is a Telugu country. I am a Telugu king. Telugu is one of a kind. And after speaking with all the lords at your court, and this is where the political part gets in. And I think that, you know, we heard that in the definition, the political discourse. After speaking with all the lords at court means what? Raya's main guys, you know, his officers, his doras, his lords, you know, are all Telugu speaking. After you have spoken with all of them, Eragave, didn't you understand that Telugu is the best of the regional languages? So on that note, I'll stop. I'm sorry I spoke too long. We'll pick up with this verse next time, tomorrow. Thank you very much.